A warm welcome here downstairs in the library, where I spent the last year quite some time here upstairs. So for me it is a great pleasure to have this debate here on the Convivialist Manifesto, not only because I'm leaving soon, but also because I really want to know whether the ideas that have been exposed in the Convivialist Manifesto are actually workable in India. In fact, the manifesto is kind of an offshoot of the Mouvement du Mons, which is the movement of the anti-utilitarian movement in the social sciences, which was founded in 1981 by Alain Caillé. And as the acronym MOS indicates, it is also a reference to Marcel Maus's famous essay on the gift, which Alain Caillé has actually worked out into a general theory of reciprocity and solidarity in contemporary society. He is also the founder of the Revue du Mons, which is a journal which is specialized in all things around gift, reciprocity, civil society, solidarity, economics, and so on. In 2011, he published a pre-manifesto, which is basically a text of some 120 pages, in which he launches some ideas to move from, if you want, not just a critique of anti-utilitarianism, but really kind of a new worldview, if you want, which, according to him, can solve some of the problems that we are facing today. It was preceded as well with a discussion between Alain Caillé, who is an economist and a sociologist, Serge Latouche, who is the man of the movement of la décroissance, the degrowth, perhaps the equivalent in India would be the post-development movement, Patrick Viveret, who is the man who has been working a lot on alternative indicators of wealth, but who himself is kind of a living social movement. So what you have is people coming from the alternative left with a strong ecological imprint. And so then they got together and they started writing, in fact, really the manifesto. The manifesto was signed by some 60 Francophone intellectuals in Germany, in Italy, and also in Brazil. There has been a debate. And I myself, being based in Brazil, I have first of all the manifesto translated, and then I invited some 20 scholars basically to write very, very short comments, 5 pages, 6 pages, basically critical reflections, illustrations, whatever it may be, on the possibility of convivialism in Brazil. Now, here in India, I actually want to do the same. I mean, I think it would even be more interesting precisely to look at some of its presuppositions and, let's say, apply or see whether convivialism in India is just an airy idea. A starting point is a nice phrase from Marcel Mauss. How can we live together with our differences without massacring each other? So the way of massacring each other is very important because the basic presupposition is conflict, but of course how you can overcome it. The manifesto starts with the challenges, and the challenges we all know them, from global warming, let's say, to very local pollution, economic crisis, social inequality which is exploding, exclusion, terrorism, communalism, and, well, let us just think about all the efforts we had to come in to do to come in the state of exceptions, war. But instead of just focusing on the challenges, and of course they are real, especially when you think about the ecological issues, we are also looking at the promises. Social consideration is also there, reducing inequality. We even propose a minimum income for all, not just a minimum income, but also a discussion on maximum income, which I think is quite pertinent. The economic issue comes in the last place, and I say in the last place because all the discussions they always start with economics. And so, in this sense, it is there. It is clearly an argument for a plural economy, not just a state and a market, but precisely, I mean, something like an economy which comes from civil society, and of course, it's against all the excesses of financial capitalism. The principles of the new humanism are pretty simple, and I would say almost universal. One is, we assume that any movement that wants to adhere must accept and subscribe to common humanity. Common sociability, this is in fact the influx from the insistence on reciprocity and giving. Moral individualism, and especially as well kind of a control of hubris, a control of excesses. All that sounds quite fine, but when you take it to the global south, although now that I've been here in India, I start to question that term, because in the global south, of course, you not only have the West, which is for instance the case for the whole of Latin America, but of course when you move to the east and to South India, I mean you can see that this euphemism of the third world is in itself a little bit problematic. The manifesto speaks of pluriversalism, but it's a little bit of a gimmick. I don't know if there's perhaps one anthropologist you know from Brazil, it might be Viveiros de Castro with his perspectivism. In any case, I mean kind of this insistence on universalism is complicated when you're thinking about alternative modernities, even alternative humanities. The individualism in itself, even if it is moral and if it is expressive, is also in itself problematic, because in Brazil and unfortunately in India, the unit is not the individual, but is always the interaction. So that makes it interesting. Again, the common humanity is in itself problematic in a society which is extremely violent and where the life of a person, especially when you're black and poor, is not doesn't have much value. So the question of common humanity is a central question. So now the question is, and what in India? On my left side, I have Ram Kakarala, an old friend, and who is also a formidable thinker. Ram is a social scientist, political scientist, but with a strong interest in legal studies, issues of citizenship, the state, and also strong interest in STS, social and technology studies. Ram, above all, I think, is an institution builder. I mean, he was at the foundation of the National Law School. He was at the foundation of CSCS in Bangalore, the Center for the Study of Culture and Society, unfortunately defunct, which does not say anything about the institution, but says something about the status of the place of private education in India. And now recently he has joined ABU, Asim Premji University, a private university, but I guess like Ashoka and perhaps like some other ones, which is not just kind of a teaching box, but which has a real, and in that case, a progressive project. On my right, Surinder Jodhka, professor at JNU, and also until, or perhaps still, visiting here at CSH. His interests are rural social transformations, and I think for the last 10 years also working on caste and stratification, inequality, from there his interest in caste, but now also in elites. His book, Caste in Contemporary India, which came out, is, I would say, typically Surinder, with a strong emphasis on empirical research, especially in the Punjab, and also a strong intervention in the debate, the question precisely of caste and how it actually works.
Which obviously, at some level, as human beings, concern all of us. I think this is something which is very, very central, and in the larger context where the triumph of neoliberal capitalism has also produced a series of disasters in the last 10-15 years, and we encounter a new disaster almost every day in one form or the other. Also the whole kind of depoliticization of many of the questions that are very central to human life have, in a sense, been marginalized in many different ways from the state system. Yesterday we had statements about MG Narega and those kinds of things where, only thing that becomes critical is growth rate or sun sex and where the numbers are going, and that's where societies, polities and middle classes try to kind of think about how politics is organized. I think even though Brazil and India are still very different from Europe or France or other parts of the world, but I think there is a context in which we need to communicate globally, because in the present day context, solutions are not possible locally. I think that is something which perhaps makes this a kind of compelling exercise. Having said that, there is also, as the manifesto rightly identifies, pluralities and diversities, not only of contexts but also of possible solutions, because histories have not become flat. There are contexts, and these contexts have their own specificities, and those specificities are real. They are not simply a question of mental constructs or just kind of preconceptions. These are histories which are kind of histories of material realities, histories of social realities, histories of cultures and communities and religions and identities. I think those are all very, very important, and therefore I think the emphasis on pluralities is very, very well taken. What I liked about it when I read it was, at some level, this is something that all of us have thought about it in one way or the other, in a sense restating the common sense. Why the world is not like this? Why is there so much violence? Why can't we be less polluted? Why do we need so much of consumption? And you realize the inequalities, you realize people who need them, and you kind of, even if you try to transfer them, but it doesn't work at that individual level. So at some level it kind of appeals to the human common sense, and this whole emphasis on common sociality is again something which is not simply a moral or normative kind of framework. It's also very, very political, and I think political because it has stakes of people, and it is not in that sense easy to bring about. Another thing I feel which needs to be emphasized, which Frederic didn't emphasize much more, is that it kind of brings discussion to questions of human dignity, and not simply in terms of material equality. Material equality is not insignificant. It does talk about inequalities, but I think the question of human dignity has not been sufficiently theorized in politics or even in social sciences. Question of humiliation has not really been theorized as a central question, of human, in a sense, requirements. Even when we talk about poverty, it's almost always seen in economic terms. But poverty is also a question of indignity and humiliation. What is more important to individuals? Is it just the lack of food, or it's the question of dignity which is more important? People don't kill themselves because they don't have food. People kill themselves because they feel humiliated, undignified, unwanted. So I think giving centrality to humanity, common humanity and sociality, I think that is something which is a big challenge, not only for people who are moral philosophers or who want to change the world, but also for social sciences. How does one think about questions like gender, questions like religious diversity, questions, caste is obviously the most important thing in Indian context, but also questions of age, questions of culture, question of media and the manner in which we make fun of others, and the kind of popular culture that has evolved, which is in a sense very strongly embedded in this whole culture of humiliation. We are jokes, for example, very strongly they invoke idea of communities and make fun of others as if it doesn't affect. Even the way we talk about disability and age obviously is something on which India has not really thought very seriously as a question of real politics or larger kind of hegemonic ideas. So there's a new global language through which we can talk about the world, and we have to. There's no choice. Nation states are still very robust categories politically, perhaps also as economic markets, but we also know there is a larger process through which that globality has become very important. And we know that the problems that we are facing today, or even the politics of today, in a sense, is shaped by kind of neoliberal economic policies which began to be adopted in the early 90s by countries in different parts of the world. The second part of my presentation is about what I think Frederic was rightly talking about, its operationalizability. Is it practical? At a normative level, obviously it is practical in the sense that we don't need it. We need it desperately. Countries like India perhaps need it much more than many other countries. I mean, the kind of violence we have in everyday life is something which is staggering, and we don't really talk about it or think about it as much as we should do. There's violence at every step in India. We experience violence in various forms, in private relationships, in families, in institutions, in public life, and obviously you have the real big open violence where people get killed every day, or disasters which again produce a kind of violence. And this violence is not random violence. This violence also has a social structural aspect, that there are only some people, or invariably there are some categories of population who become victims, and there are other categories of population who are by and large safe. Right? So there is a kind of institutionalized violence, if you wish to, which is part of our everyday life. And my own personal experience is that with this whole process of coming together and growth and development and migration, at some level that violence has increased. Urbanization has also added to that violence, and this violence is not simply a question of normativity. You can actually empirically quantify that kind of violence, and you can identify when it is violence and when it is just simple question of disagreement. What I find in a sense not really missing, but I think one was kind of, when one is reading it, one compared it with something like Communist Manifesto that Karl Marx wrote long ago. And if one was to think of it in that same kind of genre of manifestos, what one finds missing in this is a theory of society. Why have we reached here where we are? It kind of sounds a little too voluntaristic. It's desirable, we all know it is good, we should do it, but why are we here where we are? Why is it that we have so much of violence? Things come to mind immediately. One is Gandhi, second is caste, and third is hunger. I think these are three very interesting, they are very different kinds of, what one should say, metrics, but around these three metrics one can talk about this manifesto. Gandhi is, in some sense, if I was to read it as written by Mahatma Gandhi, it would actually not surprise me. Right? Gandhi spoke about many of these things in different language, in different ways. Not that Gandhi was wrong, Gandhi was right. The point is that Gandhi has been defeated in India. But Gandhi's notion of alternative paradigms of development, in a sense, help us to understand what could be the fate of this. I'm not particularly Gandhian person, but the point is that he did try to develop an alternative. I mean, we tend to, I think, judge Gandhi, I also used to do that a little harshly, because he talked about villages, and villages are, as Ambedkar rightly said, but he was not talking about villages of the past, he was talking about villages of the future. And one way of thinking about alternatives, if city is not really the way one has to live, then what could be the structure of a settlement where people live together in harmony, right? Is it possible to have cities without having inequality? Is it possible to have cities without having pollution and violence? Is it possible to have cities without having all the other problems there? So I'm not saying that village is the alternative, but the question of what one would call as experience of Gandhi as a historical subject would be an interesting learning point if one has to reflect, and why has Gandhian voluntarism failed. Hunger, and this is something that you referred to also, the desperate poverty or chronic poverty and hunger in societies like India is a big challenge. This is not something, I'm contradicting myself perhaps, but I think this is something which generates fascination for growth and justification and legitimacy for growth. And hunger is a real thing. One can easily say that hunger can be taken care of very easily by distributing the wealth. Yes, it can be. But then there are regions which are hungry and which don't produce wealth.
I read the manifesto with great interest because I have always intuitively taken to counter-hegemonic ideas, and I think this is a sort of attraction that I had in the text, and so therefore that would be a kind of a vantage point through which I would try and do a kind of a reflection as to the counter-hegemonic potential from my view as to convivialism as an idea. And thinking that this manifesto, unlike the other grandeur manifesto that Surinder mentioned, is a work in progress, and so therefore the reflection is towards creating Convivialist Manifesto 2.0 in a way. Right? So that's, I suppose, the kind of reflection and its orientation for me is thinking as to how we could make the manifesto itself transform through the reflections while manifesto transforms the way we think. Right? So that's, I suppose, is the dynamic that I'm personally drawn into. And a sort of a third prefatory footnote would be that I will draw some sort of anecdotal examples of a small project that Frédéric is familiar with. It is a multi sort of locational project on pluralism as a knowledge question. The effort of the program is to understand, number one, whether pluralism in a broad category is generally understood the same way in every kind of context, and whether we could make a universal value of pluralism in a somewhat universal fashion in these locations. And number two, whether there are any lived experiences of pluralism that would inform theory somewhat differently or enrichingly in probably something democratizing the idea of pluralism. I think the manifesto has a very engrossing and intellectually stimulating objective of producing counter narratives to the dominant materialist orientations to life. I suppose there is also a belief that either if you see it as the larger philosophical problem of coexistence, which is what was emphasized in the Frédéric sort of presentation, or in a much more specific anti-utilitarian sort of idea. I think both have great potential, but I also want to reflect from my side as to what may be certain concerns that one needs to bring to the table. So therefore, I think I'm glad to follow Surinder in that sense, because he already laid down the context in which we are seeing it. There is no doubt there are global problems. My only point of supplementation, maybe with a bit of subversion, would be, do we have global solutions? Anti-utilitarian to me looks a little, well, I suppose I understand it is more and the way one looked at it, but anti-utilitarian looks very constraining as an idea to me. And the reason for that obviously is I felt actually some of the ideas the manifesto tried to present have fundamental implication for, say, thinking about idea of contract, idea of property. Right? So, well, I suppose if I use metaphorically the legal theory example, the utilitarian statesperson, Henry Maine, when he came to India in middle of 19th century, and then went back with a feeling that he actually found an interesting theoretical framework to talk about ancient law. He proposed this thesis of status to contract. So he actually said the social progress happens in the movement from status to contract. So the modernization paradigm in a legal sense of the term actually is thinking through how social relations move from status-oriented relations to contractual relations. So coexistence, therefore, is an interesting sort of frame, but coexistence to me poses fundamental problems of finding universal solutions, right? So the problem of coexistence in the context of migration in Euro-America is one kind of an issue, and coexistence in the communal conflict in South Asia and subcontinent is a different kind of an issue. And so similar sort of a problem. How should we think through? And I think coexistence is a very appealing idea to me. It's a key idea of pluralism project that we looked at. And therefore, I think that's something that one probably should reflect in a far more contextualized sense of what coexistence could mean in the context of socio-cultural meaning-making process. As the globalization happened, we see law as a global project. One of the key things in the legal studies one is trying to understand is it that all these institutions are to be understood somewhat uniformly? Or say, for instance, the concept of dignity, Surinder raised about it. Should we understand the concept of dignity in a somewhat universal description and conceptualization? Or while dignity as a concept has a universal appeal and probably universal relevance, whether dignity is perceived in a somewhat nuanced fashion. So in other words, this is a question people in comparative law as well as comparative human rights try and pose. In other words, it is not a relativist project. It is a project of understanding universal values in a meaningful way in a hugely diverse world, right? So we must think about universal values, but in a way that we could make them more relevant and more meaningful in culturally diverse contexts. I would say the manifesto would be very enriched, and I'm taking now once again from Surinder the name of Gandhi and probably add many. If, for instance, the manifesto were to become more relevant for subcontinental context, I don't know about Brazil and other places, it would be a useful way of thinking as to what are the local intellectual resources where there seem to be convergence of the humanistic concerns the manifesto presents. I think very similar, for instance, Surinder didn't mention further, but at least one could mention the theory of trusteeship theory, right? So in other words, how should we look at property? Right? Gandhi has a particular philosophical take on why property is not like what you hold, but you actually is in trust of a larger humanity. Right? So there is a possible way by which you could take Gandhi in many ways, but I suppose useful to take is whether it is his belief that the foundational problem lies in greed but not in need, because you have enough for global needs, but definitely not for global greed.
And there are a few things that, a few assumptions that I noticed. I may not be totally correct in my judgment, but I would still flag those issues. One, as Frederic said, that the manifesto has a moral appeal. I think the entry point to the manifesto is through the ethical, where the ontology of social space is one of multiplicity, that the social is multiple, there are multiple voices, and a rational consensus is possible once we sit across the table. And if there is conflict, then that is an aberration, right? One that can be solved once we start talking about it, we start discussing about it. So the entry point or the background assumption is broadly ethical. I would contrast or rather speculate how the text would have been shaped if the entry point would have been political, in the sense like Chantal Mouffe, who is also one of the signatories to the manifesto, but I think had she worked on this manifesto, then she would have foregrounded or recognized the ontology of antagonism, that we don't start with a shared sense of humanity, we don't start with multiplicity, rather the social space is deeply divided, social space is constituted through power and affect, and that is probably a better starting point for the manifesto. That is my very initial preliminary feeling, that the ethical has been privileged when contrast to the political, in the sense Chantal Mouffe would understand it. And then obviously once the idea of the ethical is privileged, then like Professor Surinder Jodhka mentioned, there is always a negative evaluation of existing institutions, and voluntarism takes over. Right? So there is a normative sense that the institutions are bad, and probably we need to create an enclave, a normative enclave, and from there on we need to move.
Let me start with a quote from Moss, that how can we live together without massacring each other? But people in contract, do they really massacre each other? And here I want to play a little extreme question, though I am not testing the manifesto to an extreme test, but it's not who kills, the thing who kills each other, it's not like necessarily people in contract, it's terrorists who kill. It's the question of terrorism. So in a way, what Moss is saying, and this is where the line between utopia and dystopia that Khalid said blurs, is this, that can we live together with terrorists without, like, let's say, them massacring us? Now this question might look a little extreme, but that is not the purpose here. Purpose is to reach at a point in the lines of what Professor Jodhka said, that the manifesto seems to be missing a theory of society. So the point that I want to raise in the end is about towards that. And this question that might seem a little extreme is not so much if we think about the origins of contract, which we hate so much today, and we love the Amazon policy, its possibility, in the classic sense of how the problem raised by Rousseau and Hobbes was that social contract is based upon this possibility of we killing each other. Right? So in Moss and is starting from a point from where Rousseau and Hobbes, the social contract theory also starts.